So it's my great pleasure to introduce Tim McKay this afternoon. Tim McKay is the Arthur F. Thurnau Professor of Physics and Astronomy at the University of Michigan. He's also the director of the LSA Honors Program there. I first got to know him sort of virtually through a MOOC he taught last fall on practical learning analytics. And this really struck a chord with me and some of the other folks that joined in taking that MOOC about how we can perhaps better serve our students and improve the whole experience here at Cornell by using data that we already have. So with that brief introduction, I'd like to go ahead and turn this over to Professor Tim McKay.
It's a real pleasure to be here and to have an opportunity to talk about some of the activity that I've been engaged in the last 4 or 5 years at the University of Michigan, gradually moving from being a big data cosmologist, studying observations of hundreds of millions of galaxies to try and get to understand how they come to be the way they are, gradually shifting from that to studying data about hundreds of thousands of students to see if we can understand how they get to be the way they are. Both of these have been observational sciences rather than experimental sciences, so a lot of the techniques that we used before we're using again. I like to start with a picture like this because for me the whole purpose of doing anything like learning analytics is really the students. It's really trying to improve the education that we have for students, and in particular to try and personalize the education that we give to students. To place that call for personalization in a little context, I want to start with some history. So this is a picture of an early building in the life of the University of Michigan, University Hall. It was constructed in 1871. We were a public university created to generate great citizens for our society. And when they built this building, it featured a giant auditorium seating 3,000 people. And this was at a time when the university only had 1,200 students. The whole university, right? So they were planning to be a big, influential public university at that time. Here's a picture of that hall. It was really magnificent hall. Big organ at the front, giant balcony, giant floor. They held all of the collective meetings of the university in this hall. So they were thinking, even in the 1870s, about educating at scale. By 1900, enrollment had tripled to about 3,500 students, and we were entering what I would call the industrial era of education, at our institution at least. By 1950, enrollment expanded again by a factor of 10. So that was quite a 50-year period. Imagine growing your institution by a factor of 10 during your career. It's not something that we usually experience. But they had reached about almost the scale that the university is now. And in many ways, Michigan became a model for what this public research university is. There was no longer any hall in which you could hold graduation, right? You just needed to use the great outdoors. So we began doing that in a place called Ferry Field, one of the football fields. This is a picture of that commencement, marching out for that commencement in 1949. There also, as it turns out, is an aerial view of that commencement, which I really love. You can see the field down here, and the big block of graduates. I don't know if that's an early analytics bar chart that they filled out there. Maybe people got A's and B's. I'm not sure. But it also has looming in the background the future of our university, what we now call the Big House, the largest stadium in college football. Anyway, so growing, becoming an industrialized kind of place. The way this was accomplished was consonant with what was happening in the rest of the world during this period. So this is our graduation in 2010. It's become, if anything, even bigger. The crowd was really especially large for this graduation. You can see the guy who was giving the speech up here at the top. So a lot of people who had no one graduating came to see Obama give the graduation speech. The way this was accomplished, as I said, was to act in the way the rest of the world was acting. There was an industrial revolution going on, a time in which people were thinking about quantifying everything, optimizing everything, coming up with systems that worked very smoothly, carefully planned, and so on. And so public higher education did this too. It became kind of bureaucratized, standardized in a bunch of ways, adopting standardized tests. Universities like Michigan and Columbia played a big role in generating the standardized tests that we use today. They were trying to figure out how to do education at scale. Right? They started measuring outcomes in things like credit hours and GPAs and majors and minors. The things we're still using were all invented in this period of time. And just to give one example of the exploration that was going on at that time, at the University of Michigan, they adopted two different things. There were credit hours, which were how many hours the course met, and then there were how many honor points you got for taking that class. And they weren't the same for everybody who took the class. If you got an A, you got more honor points. If you got a B, you got less. A C, you got less. And in order to graduate, you needed 120 credit hours, but 140 honor points. Right? And just even opening that box in your mind makes you think, oh, there's all kinds of different ways you could do the accounting here, right? And they would create different kinds of responses for people. Being in Southeast Michigan, of course, we were right down the street from this kind of assembly line and started to think about things in this way. As the century went on, though, we came to recognize that the student body was diversifying on our campus. There were many different kinds of needs that needed to be met, and the university started to do lots of things to personalize education. Beginning right after the war, I think was really the time when this happened. But the honors program that I run was a response to this, a recognition that there were now many different kinds of students on campus, and that we needed to create different kinds of programs for them. They started to get involved in academic advising. If you go to the Google Ngram viewer and look up the phrase academic advising, you'll find it really doesn't exist before the 1970s. It's not that no one was doing any academic advising, but as a profession, it really wasn't there. It really emerges in this period as a response to try and begin to personalize education. And so we've done lots of work to try and personalize in this way. The problem is it's super expensive to do this, to essentially match every student with adults who take care of them. It's very costly. And we need to find a way at our institution to educate at scale economically. We have to find ways to do it that reach everybody more intensely and that do so within the bounds of the. So the 21st century started with an information revolution. And this information revolution has already changed almost completely the way we do our research. But it hasn't had nearly as big an impact on education yet. But I think it's beginning to. We're beginning to see a bunch of things happen. First of all, practically all information that exists in the world is available to students before they come to our campus. In fact, it's in their pocket. Right? They have all the information in the world right here. It used to be they had to come to my classroom to learn certain things. They couldn't hear anywhere else. That's sort of not true anymore. We're beginning to see classes respond to this by recognizing that it's not our job in the classroom just to transmit information to them, but we should be bringing them in and helping them work on that information while they're with us. So you see things like flipped classrooms begin to emerge, in part as a response to this. It's also true that many, maybe even most, educational activities now are digitally mediated. They happen in a way that passes through digital technology. And this provides a tremendous opportunity to understand what's going on. Because as soon as any of these things pass through that kind of digital mediation, they leave records. There's a kind of digital exhaust created in the process of this that can allow us to study what it is we do in ways we never were able to before. And I think we're going to start to put this kind of information to work to personalize education for the 21st century. And I think that's really going to be the big advance we're able to make. We got to scale in the 20th century. Now we're going to take that to a personal level, be able to educate both at scale and personally. So if we're going to personalize education, there are many things we need to know. So, for example, we need to know about the student as a student. We would like to see what it is they do and to assess what they know and understand the connection between those things, right? We would like to know what does a student have to do in order to acquire certain kinds of knowledge. If we know that, we can help students do the things they need to. We want to be able to represent their skills and their accomplishments in richer ways. Right now, students graduate, it says, they got a degree in chemistry, they had a certain GPA. It's not a very great representation of what they did in college. It would be much nicer if we could really display what they've learned and what they're capable of. You might compare that kind of credential system to what happens for a faculty member's CV. You want to know what a faculty member does? There's this rich body of evidence that shows you what that faculty member has done. Very different from the kind of way we represent an undergraduate student. If we're going to educate and personalize for every student, we also have to know them as a person, much better than we do now. And we have tried to do this by interacting individually as humans, but we also can use the information systems we have to understand better what is the background of a student as they move their way through college, how are they growing, what are their interests, what kind of goals do they have, what's their purpose in being in college. You know, if you really want to educate someone well, you have to be thinking about that. You have to know something about why they're there. We want to know about our students' well-being. If we're going to personalize education at scale, it's very important that we measure and report the things that matter. Because whatever we measure and report drives people's behavior. Right now, the only number we typically associate with a student in an important way is their GPA. And students respond to that fact that we measure that one number in a bunch of ways. Some are good, some are bad, but they certainly respond to it. It's something that's at the top of their mind. So if instead of measuring just a performance measure like GPA, we were able to begin to represent, to measure and quantify characteristics of a liberal education, like intellectual breadth and disciplinary depth. So a student might be weighing those two against one another as they're progressing along. I would really like to be able to measure and represent the range of experience of a student. So if a student has engaged in a lot of extracurricular activities, we should first of all know about it, and we should be able to represent it to the world. If they've been involved in a lot of group projects, we should be able to say something about that and help them represent the fact that that really happened. I would love to have better measures of actual student effort. So just to give a simple example of this, I think right now we could measure how many pages every student on campus turns in as assignments during the time on campus. And it would be wildly various and interestingly related to the course of the study they have and the way we think about things. I would like to be able to have a student who works really hard on campus show that in an authentic way, be able to represent it. It's also true that we have residential campuses because we believe our students are trying to build networks of connection. It's not always clear to them whether they're doing a good job of this or not, because they don't really know what other people's networks of connection are like. So if there were ways that we could begin to represent a student's network of connection, we might be able to help them realize the kind of network that they want to have. So if we ended up with a set of things that we measure, instead of just one or two, set of 6 things maybe that we measure that are aligned with what we really care about, a student could then weigh these against one another instead of pursuing just one as if it's the only thing that's important in the world. So we want to measure and report what matters. We also have to be able to act at scale. It just isn't good enough to say, I invented something that works in this little program and I'll run in this little program forever. And we've done a lot of that. And it's not a bad thing. I don't mean to badmouth it. It's just that it doesn't get you there. You know, I run a program for 10% of the students on campus. And it's pretty great for the 10% of the students who are on campus. But 9% of the students aren't getting it. So I want to find ways to reach everybody. To do things at scale. So the work that I'm going to describe has grown out of a learning analytics effort at the University of Michigan that started around 2008 or 9, and it emerged, as many things do on our campus, kind of organically. It turns out there were a bunch of places on campus where people began using data that was emerging in the digitally mediated education world to understand what was happening. One example is Stephanie Easley. Stephanie is a professor in our School of Information, and she runs a lab called the Use Lab that decided they would take on all the data from our learning management system and see what could be learned from it. What can we really see about how students are behaving or what they're doing with this? So she had this lab group that was trying to understand how people interact online, things like that. My colleague in physics, Gus Everard, was working with an LS&A IT committee. Gus is also a big data cosmologist, and they were told about the fact that the university had recently created a data warehouse and placed all the data about all those students on campus into this data warehouse. So instead of being squirreled away in filing cabinets all over campus, it was suddenly in a database so that you could query it to get it all at once. You could get at it, right? And they thought, wow, we should do projects with this. And so they started to create windows into that data set that people could use. They created something called the Academic Reporting Toolkit 1.0, and later on I'll show you the 2.0 version of that. And then I began working with some of my colleagues in physics to explore what was happening in our introductory physics courses. As we got introduced to one another, because we have a good network of kind of people saying, oh, you're working on that website, you're working on that too, why don't you guys have coffee, right? So a lot of that goes on in our campus. We realized there was something happening here and we wanted to get it going. So Stephanie and I started up a seminar series, because that's what we do, you know, we talk about stuff. We started a seminar series, we bought some sandwiches, they weren't as nice as these, because we didn't really have funding then, but we did. And we called it the Symposium on Learning Analytics at Michigan, the SLAM seminar series. And we filmed them all. They're all online. You can go watch them now. And this started a nice campus-wide conversation for us. At the same time, I was serving on a committee called the Academic Affairs Advisory Committee with the provost, one of these things that doesn't really have a very clear mission. So we end up talking about whatever the people in the room want to talk about, and this is what I wanted to talk about. So I talked a lot about making measurements and things like that, and the provost said, yeah, that's a good idea. We should pursue this. Just at this moment, the provost and president created a third century initiative in which they committed $25 million to new research projects and $25 million to new education projects. It's a great opportunity to start something new. And so we created this learning analytics task force that ran for 3 years and had a $2 million budget. We continued the SLAM seminar series. We started giving out grants. So if you were a person who wanted to do a project with student data, either an analysis to understand what was going on in a certain area, or perhaps a project to take some data and put it to work, to act on it in some kind of way, we could give some seed funding to those projects. The other thing we created was an educational tool. So we realized there were many people on campus interested in this, perhaps as there are here, but who hadn't done anything with it yet, didn't really know how to do it, were worried about getting involved in human subject research, all kinds of questions that needed to be answered. So we created a Learning Analytics Fellows Program, and that Fellows Program was really a course. Right? We brought together 40 people, graduate students and faculty, who met for 2 hours a week during a semester so that they could talk about all these issues. We could put some data in their hands and they could mess with that data. They could learn something about learning analytics. During the course of this time, I spoke to all the provosts of the Big Ten universities about what we were doing in Michigan, and they requested that we provide some kind of educational resource for their campuses. This was in about 2012, so we thought we would run a summer school, invite everyone to campus. But in 2012, a company called Coursera appeared, another one called Udacity appeared, edX was launched, right? All of a sudden there was this MOOC world that emerged. And so the Practical Learning Analytics course that was mentioned in the introduction is really that Learning Analytics Fellows Program turned into it. So all this stuff is going on. What's happening right now is that task force has reached its conclusion, and we're working to institutionalize all of the activities that we got started. We've created an Office of Digital Education and Innovation that is campus-wide, and that office provides a home for a lot of the learning analytics activities that are going on. We've also created a very powerful faculty committee called UMELA that is investigating all the questions that the administration is concerned about having investigated. As soon as you start opening this kind of data to analysis, you realize there are some quite controversial, risky questions. We really wanted them investigated, but we are happy to investigate them in a way that is cautious and careful, as long as it's happening. So we've got a committee doing that kind of work, and we've got a lot of open learning. Okay. So what I want to talk about today are some aspects of personalized education and the activities that we've been undergoing. I'm going to first say some things about ethics, about what we're doing and why we're doing it and how we're thinking about it. Then I want to talk about measurement, the data collection and management, some of the things we are doing, some of the things we'd like to be doing. About analysis, just learning from the data, measuring and modeling things, extracting some meaning from the data. And then about action, taking the data and putting it to work. So kind of all the parts of really big data science projects. And the goal we have in mind right now is that in 5 years, students will look back and say, there are things happening that make my education much more personalized than there were 5 years ago. It should be very visible to people. That's what we're aiming for. So let me first talk about ethics a bit. What is it we're doing here and why are we doing it? This is a very central question. We are doing work that has as its goal the improvement of the education system, the improvement of the education of individuals. We need to think very carefully about how we approach it. Anytime you use data about people, you have to think about what are the principles that govern the collection and the use of that data. This is true in any field that studies humans. There are norms of consent and privacy, of autonomy and responsibility. Who controls the data that we might have about you? Is it your data? Is it our data? Who owns it? And how do the application of these principles, which are present in every form of social science research, how do they differ in this environment? It is a special environment. Students come to our campuses to join a community, and they do so wanting us to attend to them in a way and at a level that they wouldn't if they were just living in this city. Right? So I think universities have to think in a special way about this, and to be very clear and open with their students about what they're doing. So in order to have some conversation about this, a group of people from a number of institutions, including Stanford, MIT, Michigan, a bunch of other places, got together in 2014, and we held a conference at a place called the Silmar Conference Center in California. It was called Learning Research in Higher Education, and the goal was to come up with some principles, to think about what principles we might use at a very high level for the conduct of learning analytics. And our intent was to match the kind of spirit of earlier information codes, like the Code of Fair Information Practices and the Belmont Report. Thinking about them, trying to think in the same kind of way. It turns out we're going to run another one of these Silmar conferences this summer in June 2016 about learner data and records in the digital era. So we're continuing this conversation. I think it's not something we can just like settle and write a report and say it's done. It's a really evolving environment, partly because the data is evolving, but also because the sensibilities about it are changing. At Asilomar, we came up with 6 main principles that look very familiar from the Belmont report because they're kind of similar. We should respect the rights and obviously the dignity of learners by being transparent and protecting their privacy, using data only in appropriate kinds of places, not just throwing it out into the world. Beneficence has to be at the center of this. We have to be doing this for a good reason. If we start to do it for reasons that don't have the interests of the people whose data it is at heart, we're doing the wrong thing. We shouldn't be doing it. This justice is, I think, a really central one for me, because I believe that work we've done with analytics has revealed inequity in many places in the system. Often cases where we were not completely clear that that was true. So analyzing data can be something that promotes justice by revealing inequity. So I think that's one of the important tools that it has. Openness, meaning that we want to share the kinds of things we're learning. We're not here to learn something about learners that we would use for profit and keep secret from the rest of the world. There's a big concern whenever we talk about learning analytics about quantifying everything. We're talking about human beings who have very rich lives. And if we are unwise about the way we go about this, we could collapse their lives to a few measured parameters and imagine that we were capturing everything. That's about the humanity of learning. And then the last piece about continuous consideration is really because everything is evolving and won't stop anytime soon. So this is not a conversation we can settle and get over with. It's something that's going to continue to happen. Let me give just one example of this, predictive modeling. So a lot of our early learning analytics efforts aim to use what people describe as predictive modeling. This is a mechanism for looking back through historical data to say, what do I know about a person early on that relates to outcomes they have later? And then putting those predictive models to work. What's really happening in predictive modeling is just studying what's happened in the past. That's all it is, right? You're just seeing what patterns were present in the past. Now, if you want to use those to predict the future, you have to assume that nothing's going to change in your system. So if you just want to keep running things the way you have, then you'll get good predictions. But I don't think that's what we want to do. I think what we want to do is learn from the past, find out what we like and don't like about what's happened in the past, and change the things we don't like in the past. So we're learning from the past to change the future, not to predict the future. So you might know if you read the Chronicle of Higher Education about a famous episode in which predictive analytics was used to decide who was going to likely to drop out soon so that they could be kicked off campus. The phrase used by that university president was drown the bunnies. He's no longer university president, even though he said this just a few months ago. So we shouldn't be doing that. We shouldn't be drowning the bunnies, right? Instead, we should be responding to this. If we realize a student is at risk, we should do something about it and make them not at risk, right? So we need to learn from the past in order to change the future. So I try not to talk about predictive modeling at all because I really don't want to do that. I want to learn from the past. Not that I'm trying to. We talked about the ways in which research should interact too. If we're going to do this kind of work, it should be used to improve higher education. So it should be shared, it should be done openly as much as possible. We will learn much more about what's happening on our campus if we can compare it to what's happening on your campus. Right? So we're trying to create an environment of as much openness as possible about this. There's many things to work against in that process because a lot of institutions are very nervous about being compared to other institutions. Mostly, though, I think they're nervous about being compared unfairly to other institutions. Right? Just to give an example, Michigan and Michigan State are 40 miles apart. Both big, important public research universities. Usually the way we're compared is Michigan's, University of Michigan's graduation rate is compared to Michigan State University's graduation. It's a ridiculous comparison. The student bodies are very different, right? If Michigan State students came to our Ann Arbor campus, we would very likely do much worse with them than Michigan State does right now. But that's the kind of comparison that's made, and it makes people very sensitive. If you make those kind of bad comparisons, you make people really defensive, so we need to think about it. There's one more point I want to make about ethics, which is that there's a weird relationship between students and their universities. When students come to a university, they turn over a big part of their reputation to us. And they say, we're going to let you control this piece of my reputation for the rest of my life. They're never allowed to erase it. Right? They enter into a relationship with us where they allow us to control the creation of their permanent record. Most of our institutions openly acknowledge whether somebody received a degree or not. So if someone says they got a degree from Cornell and someone calls up Cornell, Cornell will say whether they did or not. Make that information public, right? That's unusual. The person doesn't control that information. There's no right to be forgotten, as there is in England. And I think this is a really interesting relationship. It's a different one. I don't think people have fully worked out what this means for issues of ethics or privacy. I think there's a thinking about reputation. It's an interesting arrangement. Okay. Ethics aside, let's start talking about measurement a little bit, about the collection of data and the management of that data. So there's first what we measure now. All of our universities have a kind of standardized student record. Recently, it's not perfectly standardized, but very generally the same on every single campus in the country. It's used for things like accreditation, it's used for creating transcripts and so on. And it includes admissions information about every course that everybody takes, when they take it, who they take it with, who they take it from, what grades they receive, standard student record stuff. And then, of course, what degrees we award and what honors they might receive, the stuff that makes the transcript. That's kind of boring in a way, but it's also very rich information that hasn't been fully used. So a lot of what I'll talk about actually refers to making measurements in that data. What's been happening since we all began using more digitally mediated education, using learning management systems and things like that, is that we've started to get a record of both the process and the products of learning. So as people work on their learning in a digitally mediated environment, you get to see things about their behavior that were never present before. To give a relatively extreme example that I haven't seen people investigate very much, if you write a paper in Google Docs, which many students do right now, every keystroke is recorded. You could play back the whole process of a student's revision mechanism. You could see and understand things about it that might be very pedagogically useful to them. Right? When students participate in online discussions like Piazza, when they watch or interact with online videos, there's information recorded in the process of that. So that's process stuff. It might help us understand how behavior relates to learning eventually, because we're getting measures of behavior that we didn't used to have. Students would come in and say, oh, I worked really hard on this. Maybe they didn't. Right? Now you might be able to see. We also get the products of learning, and I think this is a really interesting area that we haven't made on nearly hard enough. Even in the simplest, most mechanical part of our education system, like perhaps where we're giving students a multiple choice test, the way we analyze that data in almost every case is to sum up the score. And that's leaving an awful lot of interesting information on the floor. Right? Each question contains information about what kinds of students got that question right and wrong. And it's not news. There's a whole field of item response theory out there that knows about this, but we haven't put that to work. And it would actually be pretty easy to do that in our highly computerized world, to have much richer reports of what comes out of an exam like that. Go to the instructors that use it. Much richer stuff, though, could happen as we begin to be able to interact with student work in things like essays. We have a big new project starting at Michigan called MWrite, which aims to put to work natural language processing tools to be able to extract more information from the student work that exists, lives on in these data systems. Used to be students turned in paper, you gave it back to them, it was gone. All that work still exists. So if we wanted to know, for example, how is student first year writing evolving over time, there is a body of evidence that we could examine now to learn about this. Didn't used to exist. So what we're hoping to get out of all this is a much richer and evolving portrait of a student, understanding where they're coming from, what they're interested in doing, what their accomplishments are. I like to think of this portrait, this holistic portrait, as a less formed thing that we would use to admit them, and then we would watch this portrait grow. We would be able to measure their growth while they're on campus, and it's through that measurement of growth that we would ultimately decide it's time for them to graduate. Right? And then we would use that same portrait to represent them to the world. Instead of saying, you got a degree in this, we would have this portrait, something much more rich, like the CV that we might use for our own careers to represent success. Now, let's talk about some very practical things. The data on our campus lives in a data warehouse which contains literally hundreds of organically growing tables. In addition to the data warehouse data, there are the learning management system things that provide us information not only about the students, but also about the courses. I don't know about you, but on our campus, about all we remember about a course is its title and its course number and who taught it. It's very difficult to get back to what was the content in that course, what were the evaluations like. That's changing, though. because of the existence of learning management systems. A lot of that stuff is in there. You can go back and find out what happened in that class. Then there's the records from all these outside things. We have students using Google Docs, using chat tools like Piazza. And there's a new emerging area which feels different. Non-academic measurements or information about students. Everything from wearable devices like Fitbits to location information that might come from your wireless network. When students connect to wireless anywhere, it's actually possible to know where they are. I can imagine the very good ways you could use this kind of information. I can also imagine ways in which you're going way over the line of what seems relevant for education. So a lot of people talking about that now, but it's not very highly advanced. Dealing with all this data is a big challenge. First of all, it's complex and there's a lot of it. In order to bring these data streams together, we have to have identifiable information. And we have to use that information in a way that maintains student privacy. We have to deal with the fact that each student's portrait, what you know about every student, is wildly different. I mean, it's certainly different from the time they were admitted to the time they graduate, but even across any cohort of students, wildly different stuff that you know about. You have to somehow handle that. Getting meaning out of this kind of data. So if you have the click stream from their interaction with the learning management system, what does it tell you? Does it tell you anything? Should you keep it? Right? We have to learn about that. And then handling incompletely defined data, particularly in real time. So if you want to build a system that aims to identify the students who are at risk, be really thoughtful about missing data, incomplete data, not making big mistakes in real time. Just to give some sense, these are a couple of the pages of the 157 pages of the description of the data structures for our data warehouse. You probably have one working around someplace too that looks like this. This is not something every faculty member is going to use. So we've come up with a partial solution at Michigan. We're trying to take the most valuable pieces of that complicated set of data that exists out in the world and clean it up and present a version of that data that is easy for people to use. This idea emerges from some of our work in astrophysics. When we built a project like the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, it had a huge number of databases with all these 50 terabytes of data in them. We wanted to make that available to researchers worldwide. We couldn't just open the door and let them into this because it's a swamp. Right? It's a mess of data. An expert could figure it out, but most people couldn't. So we came to the idea of having open data releases, public data releases, where the team that built the swamp figures out what's in it and creates a version of it that you can present to the world, which is almost transparent to use. It doesn't contain everything that exists in that data set. A real expert has to go down into the swamp. Right? But it makes available at least the 80% solution for people. So we're working on creating this data architecture. Other things about measurement. So what we really want to measure, or one thing we really want to measure, is learning in classes. And what we measure now is grades. Grades are performance measures. They're not absent of information, but we don't know what the performance measures of, because we don't know what tasks were used to generate the grades. We don't know what outcomes they were aiming for, because we usually don't record that. We just record the grade. And they're quantified in some way that is completely different for everybody. Right? So some people think a C is really good average work. It's all over the place, right? So they're not without information. We should look at them, but they're not perfect. We'd like to measure increases in knowledge, growth, right? Increases in some well-defined skills, and focus on that kind of individual growth within students. So there are some simple ways that people are using now in some contexts. Pre- and post-testing that's aligned with your learning goals can be very effective. In my own field of physics, there was really quite a revolution when people invented the first simple concept inventories. Sets of 30 questions that you could ask at the beginning of class and at the end of class and see how much people gained. What they realized was that in pretty much every teaching environment, students started out at one place and there was a perfect score somewhere up here, and after a semester of instruction, they'd gone up 25% of what they could. This was pretty shocking to us. We didn't know this was the case. We thought they were learning a lot, right? About the same time, people demonstrated that in active learning classrooms, students gain about 50% of what they did. They were really learning twice as much. And these pre- and post-testing mechanisms helped prove that to our field. So they're very good, especially for sort of foundational courses. So where we have big courses that we run regularly and have clearly defined goals that are reasonably stable, I think that kind of system should be in place in kind of all of those. It really makes a lot of sense there. If you're going to teach a seminar on a subject that you're just inventing this term and it's going to come and go, maybe not so much. But in that kind of foundational environment, I think it's really important. There are also indirect ways we might measure learning that I think will gain a lot in future years. Some of them are fairly simple, like the item response theory that I mentioned for exams that we're already giving. Some are more complex, things like natural language processing tools and categorization by comparison, which can be a very powerful way of taking a bunch of student writing, being able to understand where they lie on the spectrum. So eventually we may be able to look across student learning on our campuses by examining all the artifacts of student learning in more automated ways and be able to see generally evidence. These are a little for the future, but interesting. You know, what we measure right now is pretty limited. We have this credit hour and degree requirement economy. So people meet categorical degree requirements in a widely various variety of ways. Credit hour designations on our campus are certainly widely variable. A 3-credit class is not just a 3-credit class. Every student knows it. If you speak to them about registering for classes, they'll talk about taking this and this real class and a couple of other classes that they don't designate as real. Right? That's the kind of language they use with us. It's also true that, you know, we learned I had always thought that a lab class, the standard was 2 hours for 1 credit in the lab class, 1 hour for 1 credit in the lecture class. But on our campus, there are labs that are 2 hours and 3 hours and 4 hours that are all 1 credit. I didn't know. Just way what? So widely various. And then we measure performance only by grades. On our campus, average grades given out in classes vary by 25% across different disciplines and across different course levels. So in every department, lower level classes give lower grades. They rise as students go along. We have courses that give out median average grades of 2.5 and courses that give out median average grades of 3.95. Just to average them together as if they were the same as the list. I mentioned a little bit the idea of measuring what matters. I would really like to move to a set of outcomes like this and to represent a student's experience in a multidimensional way. So they won't be climbing just a single axis in their effort to look like a really good student. I think if we do this, and if we get to having categories like this, we'll be reinforcing authentic goals. We'll be saying, what are you here for? You're here for intellectual depth and disciplinary growth. You're not here for GPA. You're here for these things, at least. Even just calling them that. Success also should be observed more about growth by growth than by final state. Right? We have a subset of students on our campus who seem to believe that they have punched their ticket when they get admitted. And that their goal on campus is to spend 4 years here. Right? Those are not students we really want to have on campus. And I think if we could recognize they really aren't going very much. So let me give one example. How might we measure intellectual breadth? I had a student, Carr Epker, a computer science student, do a project with me, a senior thesis project last year on this topic. What we wanted to do is we wanted to see how can we measure the network of connection among students. And the way we did it was to use course co-enrollment. So if a student is co-enrolled in a course with another student, then we call them connected. This is actually what network theorists would call a bipartite network. Every student is connected to another student through a course. There's a set of courses up here, so the students down here. And every course is connected to other courses through students. The same student takes both courses. So you could look in this at a network of courses, how are courses connected to one another? Or a network of students, how are students connected to one another? Lots of interesting information in there. And the bad thing is, you know, the fact that you're co-enrolled in a class with someone isn't necessarily the richest interaction. But it might be very thin. But at least it's well measured. We know it really happens. So we're thinking about better measures of interaction. So you can start with really simple things. How many students is every student connected to? The average student at the Michigan campus is connected, co-enrolls in classes with about 5,000 students. That gets as high as like 15,000 for pre-med. A lot of big classes. What kind of students are you connected to? You want to think about how to weight it. So for example, clearly if you're in a giant class with somebody else, your interaction with them must be less. Right? So somehow we should maybe weight that. So we thought about all these kind of things. It's really interesting to start thinking. What we have done that's really interesting to look at right now, sort of first result, is about diversity of connection. In a network like this, you can take the actual network you have with this number of students and this number of courses connected in this way. And then you can create random realizations of that network. It's kind of like saying, if the students came to campus and they took courses in the same pattern, but randomly, without any selections, you would still have them spread across this. It would still be a network, right? But it would be a different network. And comparing the real one to the random one is a way of saying how much more likely are they to be in a class with people of their own major than if it was a random one, if something new in that one period. So we made these kinds of measures. They have an in degree and an out degree. How often do they take things with people in the same major as them? How often do they take things with people not in the same major? And this allows us to expose the isolation of different majors and to make comparisons of individuals. So let me just show you a kind of result. I'm not going to try and explain all the details of what these numbers mean, but you can first look at all the different majors and say which majors are most isolated and which majors are most diverse in terms of course taking. And you can see that the couple that land at the top of our list of most isolated are things like musical theater, physical education, music theater, or music theory. And the things that land in the most diverse are classic liberal arts field, right? A lot of classic liberal arts field. And some categories like general studies, which is a degree we have that has very limited degree requirements. This is by a lot of students who are trying to finish it. Okay. You can then go into one of these majors and look at all the students. So here's a set of 71 people who majored in musical theater. Almost all of them sit here together, almost completely isolated from everyone else. Much more likely to take a course with other musical theater students than they were with anyone else. And the one who's not like that was a joint English and musical theater. No miracle. But it's good for us because it means the numbers we're measuring means something. Right? Looking at these outliers help us see that. This is the distribution for philosophy. You can see these are all up at 1.99. They're really cramped up against the end. Philosophy is more diverse, and the most diverse one is a philosophy pre-med. This is general studies, and this one's kind of fascinating because there are actually students in this general studies degree who are less likely to take courses with other general studies students than they are to take courses with people in other majors. They're pushed away, somehow pushed away from it. Right? And this is the students who are down there actually are transfer students. They came in, they ended up completing a general studies degree, but they're not like other general studies students at all. Right? They just used this degree because they were able to meet people. Now, the last thing about measurement is that we really like to address the long term. It's not really enough for us just to make measurements about what happens on campus. We want to know where our students come from in a richer way. We want to know what happens with them while they're with us, and more about what they do after they leave. We're now thinking a lot about how we might explore the lifelong impact of education. At Michigan, we have a place called the Institute for Social Research, which for 60 years has been doing research with government administrative data like census data to understand things like the consumer confidence index. We're hoping to bring together educational data with that kind of data to be able to see where do students go on to, what kind of jobs do they take, where do they live, how much money do they make, what's their life like. This is very sensitive data. There's lots of personally identifiable and sensitive information in it. So this is a research project. This is not something that we're aiming to open up to the world. We want to create a research archive. And Jason Owen Smith at the Institute for Social Research is running this thing called IRIS, the Institute for Research on Innovation and Science. It's going to provide the focal point for this. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about both analysis and action on data. So first, let's talk about analysis, about modeling data and extracting some meaning from it, and understanding how background structures affect outcomes. I'm going to give 3 little examples. I'm going to talk about an analysis of whether a living learning program is having the impact it wishes to. I'm going to talk about an analysis about whether placement exams are actually working as well as you would like them to. This is a question kind of about prerequisites. And then I'm going to ask about whether our classrooms are equitable. So the first is about living learning programs. We have a program at Michigan called the Health Science Scholars Program. It's a living learning community that aims to support students who want to go on to become doctors. Right? People coming in their freshman year. Not surprisingly, we have a program like this. The research question really is, how does participation in this learning community impact outcomes? And the particular goal was to understand its impact on 2 at-risk groups, first and family students and ethnic minorities. Right? The literature is full of good testimonials about how impactful these programs are, but not good measurements. And so Chris Brooks and Stephanie Teasley and some others went ahead to try and make these measurements, and they reported these measurements to Learning Analytics and Knowledge Commons. The way they did this was to use a quasi-experimental design. Quasi-experimental design is to take advantage of the fact that you might have many people in a sample who participate in the program, many other people who are otherwise very, very similar to them who don't participate in the program. This is actually true in many cases on our campuses, because a lot of our programs are relatively small and are not necessarily making selections that admit everyone who would like to be part of the program. So what they did is they used matched samples. They used a bunch of different data about every person who was in the program and every person who was not in the program to identify a match of people in the program and not in the program across all of these different kinds of criteria. So a bunch of stuff about preparation, stuff about demography, about family income, about whether they were first in college and so on. And then they can take those matched samples and compare outcomes. And it's a quasi-experiment, as if it was a randomized controlled trial. It's not perfect, but it's a powerful tool. So what they found is that when they examined all the students in the learning community, there were no statistically significant difference in outcomes. Students who came in were in health science college program, came into the university, they all went on to medical school at the same kind of rate, they achieved their goals at the same kind of rate. But underrepresented minority students were significantly more likely to complete a master's degree in science or an undergraduate degree in science. Quite significantly more likely. And the same is true for students who were first in the family. So it has an impact, but it has an impact on some people, people who need a different kind of support. And this was something that they didn't know. So it gives a chance to start to understand not only does it work, but who does it work for and how. Right? A second example, this is work done by Ginger Schultz in our Department of Chemistry, along with a couple of graduate students. We have an unusual model for chemistry at Michigan. The usual model is you take 2 semesters of general chemistry and then you take 2 semesters of organic chemistry. But at Michigan, students come in from high school chemistry, and they can either have a high AP score or take placement exam and be directed directly into organic chemistry. The remainder of the students who come in without the higher AP score or have lower placement test scores go to a general chemistry class, then 2 semesters of organic chemistry, and then a second semester of physical chemistry. So different pathways for people governed largely by these placement exams. And the intent is that we identify students who really need to take general chemistry first before they go to organic chemistry, and we make sure they do, right? That's what people intend from this. So their notion, really, is that if the students who are being directed this way went straight to organic, they probably wouldn't do very well. That's why we did it. It's all with good intent. So the idea of this analysis is to figure out, is that really true? Are we making the right choice by directing people? This analysis uses a method called regression discontinuity. So let me explain what that means. Students come in with some score on this chemistry placement test, right? And that score correlates to their grade in a later class. It correlates to the grade, unsurprisingly. So students with really low placement test scores would get lower grades, students with high placement tests would get higher. What's happened here is that at this point, we've told all these students to take that Chem 130 class, to take general chemistry before they go on. And above this point, we tell people to go straight to organic. Right? So you imagine that if they hadn't taken general chemistry, this would be one line. But the people who took general chemistry get some boost and create a regression discontinuity, that little difference between those two. This is a very powerful method of causal inference that social science researchers have developed in a pretty sophisticated way. What it allows us to measure in this case is that the outcome of taking that one full semester of general chemistry on your later course grade is about 0.2 letter grades. So remember, they came into campus, and we had a sense that if they took organic chemistry right now, it would be a disaster. So they better take general chemistry. At the end of a full term of general chemistry, a difficult class that gives out low average grades, sets them back a semester in their progress. They're doing 0.2 letter grades better in organic chemistry. That's not what we thought it was, right? It might still be worth it. There might be other benefits and so on, but it's not what we thought it was, and we didn't know this before we did it. I have become reasonably convinced that the prerequisite system that we have that insists that you must do this before you do that is probably not very wise, that we should be at least much more flexible about that. It's not to say that taking the first course before the second isn't a good idea, but to make it really rigidly enforced as if it was obvious that everyone should do that, I think it's third analysis example, this one is one of my own. So is it the case that our courses are equitable? There are many indications that there might be gender performance differences in big introductory courses. So I went to investigate this in our own courses. So let me show you an example of that. This figure represents a relationship between a student's grades in their other classes. So this is a student's grades in their other classes on the x-axis. And their grade in an introductory physics course. That's what's on the y-axis. Right? What we've done is we've binned up the students in each bin of grade in other courses and we represent the average grade those students receive in the physics class by one of these points with a very small error bar on it. It's a small error bar because there are 20,000 students in this figure. So each point represents the mean and the error on the mean for a group of students with this GPA. What grade did they get? Now, the first thing you should see on this figure is that there's a one-to-one line going up there. If students receive the same grade in this class that they receive in physics, in their other classes, they'd be on that line. But you can see all those means are below that line. That difference between a student's GPA and their grade, if we average it over all male students, is 0.3 letter grades. That means that if you're a male student, you sign up for this class, you take the class, on average, your GPA is going down, and by about this, with this kind of impact. It's not you, it's true year after year after year. It's not you, it's a system. Both the grades given in the other classes and the grades given. The problem is that we see a very big gendered performance difference. So these points on the top represent male students, the points on the bottom represent female students. And that grade penalty for female students is 0.6 letter grades, not 0.3. So the gender performance difference in this class is about 0.3 letter grades. Right? We have since examined this kind of grade penalty and gender performance difference for all of the big introductory courses on our campus. And this is a figure that represents that. There are 39 classes at Michigan that have average enrollments of 400 or above. Which a lot of people, a lot of big classes. And what we've plotted here is the course's grade penalty on the x-axis and the gender performance difference on the y-axis. So the course grade penalty is a measure of whether high or low grades are given out of this class. On this side is grade penalty, and that side is grade bonus. And the gender performance difference is on this axis in such a fashion that courses on the top, female students do slightly better, courses on the bottom, male students do slightly better. Looking at this figure, there are two kinds of main features. There's a big group of classes that sits around 0, 0, where you would expect classes to sit. They're normative in terms of the grades they give out. They show no gender performance differences. And there's a big group of classes on the lower right. That bigger group of classes is every one of our large introductory science and math courses plus Econ 101 and 102. What singles these courses out? It was a question we really had to ask. So one thing we examined was whether this was true of all science classes, and it's not. So lab courses live in one place, and lecture courses live in another. I believe that the presence and the ubiquity of these gender performance differences in these classes is an indictment of the nature of the way these classes are taught. I think we've created an inequitable environment in these classes, and that this is kind of pretty robust evidence that that's really the case. I should say, what we've done here is to show you just the impact of GPA on grades in these classes. And I'm sure many of you can come up with other things that might impact student grades in these classes. We have used all of those things to try and explain this difference and have been unable to do so. It really keeps coming back to these classes themselves. We've also done this analysis on 5 other major university campuses and see the same kind of pattern in gender performance differences. So I think something about the way we structure these things is a sign of classroom inequity, and I think we have an obligation to act to address what I would call disparate impacts here. This is really almost the legal definition of disparate impact. It's pretty much large enough to count. All right. So if that's depressing, as it is to me, you might want to do something about it. And action is something that the data can do for us as well. The first kinds of actions that I'll talk about have to do with just decision making and storytelling, helping people understand data, and the last one has to do with motivating change. So the real next frontier is to use technology to put data in people's hands. Data is good for making decisions. We all have to make a lot of decisions. We should have it. So we could support decision making. We could trigger personal connections. We could say that you really should talk to you. Right? We could use data to make those connections. That would be cool. To motivate action, to help people change their own behavior. Understand it. That's why I'm wearing this Fitbit. I want to change my behavior, and that data is helping me do it. Right? If I have a day where I don't walk 10,000 steps, I go home and go, no, maybe I should go for a walk. It's different. So we have created something called the Digital Innovation Greenhouse. This is one of the outcomes of that Learning Analytics Task Force. Its idea is to take good ideas developed on campus and grow them up from innovation to infrastructure and use them in personalized education. It was born to solve a recurring problem on our campus. We all the time have faculty innovators inventing something in the context of one class, showing that it's really good, even like sharing it with their colleagues until their colleagues are like, oh, I want to use that too. But the faculty innovator cannot deliver that thing to all the people who want to use it. They're not good at it. They don't want to do it. They aren't rewarded for it. This is actually the same problem you have in the business world when somebody invents something. An inventor comes up with something, the world, probably could use that thing, but the inventor is not the person turning the product. It requires different skills. So what happens usually is you hit what people call the entrepreneurial valley of death between innovation and infrastructure, and you need to somehow get across it. And we have created this digital innovation greenhouse as a place to mature these ideas and spread them both on campus and off. I'll just say a word about the language we chose to use here. I work in a college of literature, science, and arts. If we said we wanted to build a business accelerator in that college, it would go nowhere. Right? People don't like business language. But a greenhouse, you can't go wrong with a greenhouse, right? You bring in your little seedling and you nurture it, care for it. There's cross-pollination that takes place, right? Eventually we plant it in the field. So that's why we chose this metaphor. We do this work within our Office of Digital Education and Innovation, which emerged just a couple of years ago to provide a really nice gathering place for people who aim to execute this change in education. The DIG team is a really fun group to work with, so I'm the principal investigator of this group, and we have a core group of developers. There are 3 listed here. We're hiring 2 more right now. We have user experience designers. This is a crucial part of it, because when I write software, it's crappy for the user. It works, right? But I don't know how to make it good for the user. Mike does. We have a behavioral scientist. This is a really interesting part of the work, is that Holly is an expert in helping people change their behavior. She did it in smoking cessation and things like that for years. Now doing it in education. A community of practice lead. It's really important that these products be developed for the users. So if I come in with an innovation, I think I know what it should be, right? It's probably not what it should be, because other people want something different. So making sure we have those connections. And then we're trying to work with a whole suite of different faculty innovators who bring different projects in. The other key element, really, of this digital innovation greenhouse is a set of interns, fellows from our student body that I'll say a little bit more about in a minute. So the idea of how this works is that innovators and pioneering adopters come up with things. They work with this team of developers that is strongly connected to a community of practice during the development process, and eventually we hand these things off to university IT to run at scale. Some of these things may become companies. That might happen. We're part of the Unison Consortium, a big set of universities using similar education technology. And the main place we want it to grow really is on campus, but some of it may grow off campus as well. It's a real place. It's been really fun to set it up. We packed people into a tiny office for a little while. We just got a new space, and we're really excited about that. And our students have been really the most fantastic creative engine that we have. We adopted their idea of running things like design jams and hackathons, and it turns out you don't have to pay anybody anything. You hardly even have to buy them pizza. And they show up and work for like 8 hours and come up with 20 great ideas. It's amazing what they do. So that's been a really fun part of this process, and it's allowed us to grow a lot faster to accomplish a lot more. We started the process with the 3 tools that you see listed on the top, but this idea was obviously a good one. We started last May, and we already have 6 major projects that are inside the system. So I'm going to talk about a couple of these projects and show you what it is we're doing. The first 2 are about giving information to people. The first thing you can do with information is put it in people's hands. So the first one is an extension of the ART 1.0 tool that aims at students. When students go to select a course, it would be nice if they had more information about that class. We have that information. Why don't we share it with students? So we have created a kind of baseball card for every class on campus that contains a bunch of standardized information about that class so that students can learn about it. It includes things like enrollment. Who has taught this class and when did they teach it? You might like to know if you taught this class before or not. What do people who take this class go on to major in? Which school or college do they come from? There's also an instructor level of this tool that lets the instructor dig deeper and understand things about the way different groups of students are performing in their class. Right? These course cards are going to be extended this summer with reports on courses of study, so like majors and minors. How do people go through those? We're imagining making baseball cards for each person on campus. So if you're a student, you should be able to see how you're doing compared to people that you would care about comparing yourself to, so that you can understand your progress. You might have the same thing for faculty members. We're also talking about tools for curriculum exploration, the ways in which students could find their way through the campus. So this tool launched last week on the 23rd of March, and it's growing fast. I got this report this morning that yesterday was our first 1,000 user day. So our students are backpacking right now, thinking about their classes. kind of tool aims to provide information to academic advisors, and this is called Student Explorer. It's a tool that allows an academic advisor to look through all of the students that they're responsible for and to get a status on their performance in each of the classes that they're registered. Just get an idea. And, you know, very often it's the case that the student is not doing as well in one of their classes, and that's not really necessarily a problem, it's something that just happens. But if you see a student who goes red across the board, that's something you really might want to do something. So that's one way it's used. This is an early warning system. But the other way it's used is as a way of talking to a student about their progress. I've done a bit of academic advising, and when a student comes in and you say, so how are you doing? They almost always say fine. Because who doesn't say it? Even though it might not really be true. And there's certainly something to work on, no matter who they are. So this lets you drill down into the students' courses to see where they stand compared to the other people in the class, and eventually to go all the way down to different assignments, what they're doing each week, to see what's going on. So advisors use this. They're not pouring through this looking, watching what everybody's doing. But when a student comes in to talk about how they're doing, they can now go through it and look at it. And they seem on both sides to find that valuable. The last thing I want to talk about is acting directly. We are using computer-tailored electronic coaching, and its goal is to increase student success and perhaps also to increase equity on campus. So what is this electronic coaching? Electronic coaching is a way of trying to realize a campus on which you have available to you expert, personalized coaching that gives you timely feedback, encouragement, and advice in a convenient way. Right? So like someone who's hanging out outside your dorm room that you could stop and check in with every day. Really convenient, really knows everything that's going on with you. It would be wonderful if we had coaches like that. So instead, we're using some technology that was developed for digital health coaching to try and do this. That's what this eCoach tool is about, computer-tailored support. We can provide whatever kinds of content we would like to provide to a student. If they came to us and we knew a lot about them, we can deliver through this kind of tool. So this is running right now in a bunch of large classes. It can provide things like, our statistics instructor likes to provide them with get things done lists. It can give them feedback and encouragement. How are you doing so far? It can provide them with context for where they are. One of the tools they like the most in this system is a grade predictor. It just lets them see how they're doing. It's not doing anything fancy. It's not anything they couldn't do, but it does it for them and makes it, puts it in front of them. They like to see it. Okay. Here's another example of ways in which we're using this. This is a tool called Exam Playbook, and it aims to work with a student to walk through the preparation for their exam. This one's actually been tested now in a random controlled trial, a 4-arm study, to see whether the different elements of it really work, and they're quite effective. What it does is it says, all right, you've got an exam coming up, it's 10 days out. Let's help you get ready for that exam. So on the next page, we're going to help you choose the resources you use to prepare and plan how you're going to use those resources. So the first thing it does is ask you, which resources will you use to prepare? And you can go through the list of all the things that the instructor has decided might be useful resources. And you click the ones that you care about, and they show up in your list of resources. Once you've chosen those resources, we want you to think about why you picked that list. What are you going to do with them? Why are they important? And so it asks you which resources will help you prepare, and describe why you think it will be useful, and be as specific as you can. And then the student actually types in things like this. Right? Why am I going to ask questions in class? Well, if I get confused, it'll be best if I can clarify in the moment what I don't understand. Why am I going to study past exams? I'll be able to question like what I'll see on the exam, especially the free response stuff, which I'm worried about. After they're done choosing the resources, it asks them to do some planning. So what are you going to do? Where are you going to do it? And when are you going to do it? Right? And this asks them to fill this out. So the student might write, I'm going to go to office hours at the Neustadt building on Tuesday and Thursday. I'm going to take at least 1 practice exam, 2 if I don't feel confident when I'm done, like it's a real exam at home on Wednesday at 8. Right? And it's not surprising that this would be a useful thing for students to do. And then they can get a response that comes back to them. Here's how you did. How do you feel about your grade in this exam? Did you do the things that you planned to do? It's a structure for helping students go through these things. And because it is personalized, it's showing their data and the responses that they made. It's a way we can use these tools to do something more personal. Right. And then here's an example of a reflection on that. Things they can do for the next parts of the class that are based on what it is they said they want. This all grew out of our Center for Health Communications Research, which does digital health coaching and has for the last 25 years. they have learned not only what kinds of things you should do here, but how you should do it. It turns out that if you want to tailor and have messages well received, it's not just what you say that needs to change, it's also who says it. So when Professor McKay says you really need to start studying a week before your exam, students don't believe it. That's just Professor McKay. But if their roommate says, no, I took that class last term, you really need to start studying, they'll listen. So now we get to say it that way. We can use a testimonial from a peer that's matched to the student in identity. So if you're a pre-med student and you're worried about doing well in class, we can give you a pre-med student who says, I'm a pre-med student, I was really worried about doing well in this class, but I learned that if I did this, I'd be successful. This stuff comes right out of the smoking cessation work, where they realize that if you're a 45-year-old mother of 3 and you're trying to quit smoking, you don't want to hear from an 18-year-old. It doesn't work. So they match identities. eCoach is being used extensively. It's been used by more than 10,000 students now, and we're preparing right now to reach every student in the fall. Our goal, and it may be overambitious, is to try and deliver some of the interventions that might ameliorate stereotype threat to all the students who are on campus and see whether it affects the gender performance patterns that we see. We're not sure we can deliver them effectively enough to make that change. We're just not sure, but we're going to try. And we're working with a bunch of social psychologists. So that's where this is headed. Okay, so I think the future of all of this is that we have the tools to expose information that can enable everyone on campus to learn from the experiences everyone's doing. That's got to be good, right? For people to be able to learn from the experiences we came before. We'll also be able to explore, understand, and represent students and what students and faculty do in much better ways, and maybe encourage richer experiences. Can make education richer and more authentic. I've come to think of our university as a giant experiment. It is. Whether you attend to it or not, it's an experiment that's going on. And if we gather data, if we instrument that experiment by gathering this kind of data, we'll be able to learn more things. That's what we're really looking for. Okay, and I'll stop there, and I would be happy to take questions from anyone.
I also have a microphone that will help us hear any questions. So I just have a kind of philosophical question about the exam playbook example. Do you worry at all that you're eliminating the opportunity for the students to learn how to manage their own lives effectively? Or do you see this more as you're modeling how to do it so that they're better at it down the road? Is there any data on this, or have you thought about trying to look at something like that?
I think we always think about this. You know, when you help a student in almost any way, you think about whether that help you're providing is coddling or modeling. I know that my son is a junior in college right now, and I want to do everything for him because it's driving me nuts that he's not doing it, right? That would be coddling. It would be wrong for me to do all of that for him. So I think that a student would not use this tool if they really already had this ingrained in themselves. You know what I mean? So it might be that they haven't thought about how they might write on their calendar a week before the exam, sit down and plan. Right? And if they did have that habit, they wouldn't need a tool. And they wouldn't use it. So I kind of come down more on the side of it's modeling for them. I think it's a great research question to ask. Do you see negative consequences of the tool? You know, what are they and how would you see them? When would they occur? The day a student shows up in my office and says, I did the exam prep tool and I still failed. You know, that's when I'll know something is going wrong.
Well, how is Michigan approaching the gender differential penalty in the large classroom science class?
It's a great question. A lot of people still don't want to believe it's true. Not that they don't believe the statistics that I present, but that they believe there must be something else explaining it. It isn't really the classes, you know what I'm saying? It's a hard thing to believe. I mean, I teach those, that's my class I just showed you, right? I hate that.
Yeah.
But I've done enough work on it personally to really not be able to explain it any other way. So I believe that. I think many people are still skeptical about that.
And you're not seeing it in the lab either, so
it's really interesting. I think that it is related to the high-stakes examining environment that we use in these classes. I bet if we shifted away from that, we would see it change. That's a big shift though. And I might do it in my class, but to get everyone on campus to do it is really hard. That's why we're trying this intervention approach first. If we could do something that would protect people against it in the current environment, we could change things quickly, right? But the next experiment is actually, we have a grant proposal in right now to work on this stuff, and it's part of it, is to take one of the big classes and dramatically change the evaluation environment. The challenge there is that as soon as I do that, all my colleagues will say, you just watered down the class completely, it's a joke, whatever, you know? So you have to somehow figure out a way to fight against that, to generate evidence that can convince them, the students who just took this different kind of evaluation, Jones identical performance differences, they know as much as the students who were taking the traditional form. So it's a hard struggle.
So, of course, you can collect huge amounts of data and analyze it. But then the question is, how are the interventions on the part of the students handled? So you have this tool that's an automated tool. I'm just trying to figure out, it seems like the most effective interventions always involve person-to-person contact. How effective are these purely electronic tools, particularly with the students that we're most concerned with?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, of course, in the nature of this, we're gathering data that allows us to draw inferences about impact, right? So we have demonstrated that the students who interact extensively with eCoach have improved classroom performance. And the students who interact the most gain about a half a letter grade in their grade. Those students are not only drawn from the top of the grade distribution, you know, at the start of the class, but they are preferentially drawn from there. The usual problem that you have is the students who need things the most may not use them. So we're thinking about it, concerned about that. I think being able to use the human resources that we have more efficiently by knowing who we should be getting to is one of the ways that we can increase that. So the Student Explorer System advisors have found that really helpful in meeting their goal, which has always been what you described, to talk to the student as an individual, but knowing who to talk to. When I worked in advising, you know, there are some go-getter students who are wonderful and they come in for an advising appointment every term and it's fun to talk to them, you know. I got nothing for them, really. They don't need me, and they're filling up all these advising appointments. So, not that I don't want to talk to them, but you know what I'm saying. Optimizing the use of those human resources is another way to impact. Yes?
I teach a large intro stat class, and we have an assessment that you can assess students' attitudes towards statistics before they take the class. And I've analyzed that data, and we found that the women in my class do as well or better on their final average, but their pre-assessment of how they'll do is significantly lower.
Yeah.
So we ask them what grade they expect to get, and the women always underestimate their final grade, and the men overestimate their final grade. And we've looked at race and gender too, but I wonder if you've done any work. And we're trying an intervention now where we're videotaping current TAs who are talking about how they struggled with the class and then they finally did better, sort of the interventions of it gets better, and we're going to put it on the website. But I wonder if you've done any looking at women and minorities' attitudes towards these class, and then having faculty try to deal with things like stereotype threat or the behavioral intervention work that goes with sort of Claude Steele's work.
Sure, exactly. So that's great. I love working with statisticians because they tend to gather a lot of data and use it. The statistics class on our campus is taught by a senior lecturer named Brenda Gunderson, who's a wonderful person. She has 2,200 students in that class. Wow. It's colossal and incredibly diverse, right? Because they come from all kinds of disciplines. And she does the most amazingly good job with that very difficult task, I think. So in this coaching system, we don't just use information we know about them from the student record, we also can ask them questions about attitudes. So we've been trying to use that mechanism to identify people who might be in a kind of unidentified fixed mindset kind of mode. Very common thing if you teach physics is to have someone walk in your office and the first thing they'll say is, I'm not a physics person. And they're kind of laying it out there. So I'm never really going to learn this. I'm not really responsible for learning this, right? Just want to make it clear. So if they have that feeling, that's one of the first things you want to work on, right? So I think that if you go right back to the beginning and think about personalization, this is one of those things. Keep think? How do you feel about this? What's your affect? It's actually very important. And helping students work through that. I would think you're in a great position where you've got students who are underestimating their future performance and lots of evidence that they are, and you can take that to them at the beginning of class and say, look, I know you're probably worried, but you should be confident, because you're probably going to do fine. That should be a big help for you. Then they're going to start flowing away to them.
So we're officially out of time. We're going to squeeze in one more question, and I'll encourage people to grab more lunch on the way out.
Great presentation. I enjoyed your examples. As a follow-up to one of the earlier questions, you mentioned the living learning communities and the data showing that those communities overall did make a significant difference with the overall population, but when you focused on first-generation college students as well as underrepresented minorities, there were significant differences. Did the University of Michigan use that data? Did they apply focused practice in maybe targeting those types of students for the living learning communities, since they seem to benefit more from it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why we want to understand the nature of these impacts. I don't think this result was a big surprise. I think it was what people who create those kinds of communities have long thought was the case. I mean, I think they probably hoped there would be more impact on the average students who were in their program, but I don't think they should have been super surprised by that. Those students are separating them out and not changing their experience in the same kind of way that it's done. So I think they were already doing some of this. It's certainly the case that they, the people who run that program were right in the middle of this study. They were doing it because they really want to know how to use their program most effectively. Okay.
So thank you very much, Tim, for coming and for sharing this with us. Small Cornell token.
Cornell token. Well, you're a